Good evening. Tell me, from which city are you listening to this story? Do you know what the temperature is where you are tonight? Because in Lyon, back in 1972, it was cold, bitterly cold. And in that frozen silence, a man was preparing the unthinkable. Spring was late to arrive in Lyon. The century-old stones of Croix still held the chill of winter, and the morning fog clung stubbornly to the narrow, winding streets of the old workers' quarter. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where windows opened for neighborly chatter, and children played in the same alleys their grandparents once had. But in March 1972, something changed. Madame Beaumont was the first to notice it. 60 years old, widow of a railway worker, she had a morning ritual. She opened her windows every day, no matter how cold it was. She used to say that fresh air was medicine for the soul. But that Tuesday morning, when she pulled aside her lace curtains and unlatched her wooden window, a smell hit her. Sweet, heavy, like meat left too long under the sun, but not quite. It was thicker, denser, more present, almost alive. She slammed the window shut and mentioned it to her downstairs neighbor, Madame Garnier, when they crossed paths on the stairway. "Must be a blocked drain," said Garnier, shrugging. "Or maybe a dead cat in the cellar. You know how it is." But it wasn't that, because the smell didn't come from below. It came from the street. More precisely, it seemed to drift from the very heart of the neighborhood, from a small shop that had opened just 6 months earlier, the modern butcher shop. The owner's name was Marcel Fournier, an average-sized man in his early 40s, with thick hands and a spotless white apron. He said he'd come from Auvergne, hoping to start a new life after the death of his wife. The locals of Croix, known for their quiet distrust of outsiders, were cautious at first, but Marcel quickly won them over. He always smiled. He offered cooking advice. He gave bones for dogs. He slipped an extra slice of sausage to families with many children. And his meat, oh, his meat was extraordinary, tender as butter, flavorful, and sold at unbeatable prices. Soon, customers were lining up outside his shop every Saturday morning, while the old Grangian butcher 3 streets away was losing its clientele week by week. "How do you do it, Monsieur Fournier?" asked Madame Peltier, a retired schoolteacher who always bought a roast on Fridays. Marcel would smile, wiping his hands on his apron. "A good butcher never reveals his secrets, Madame. But I can tell you this, I choose my suppliers very carefully." He always emphasized that word suppliers, as if it were some private joke. No one understood. No one wanted to understand. But the smell lingered. Some days it was barely noticeable, a faint, nauseating whisper in the spring air. Other days it was suffocating, especially in the late afternoon when the sun warmed the cobblestones. "It's unbearable," complained Monsieur Thibionnier, lighting his third cigarette in an hour to mask the stench. "Smells like a sewer exploded." But the sewers had already been inspected twice. The city sent a team after a petition signed by 23 residents. They found nothing wrong. "Maybe it's the tannery by the river," someone suggested. "Or the glue factory near the Rhone. Or maybe it's just the weather. This humidity makes everything smell." Excuses multiplied, because admitting they didn't know where the smell came from was more frightening than believing a bad explanation. And while the neighborhood debated, people began to disappear. Sophie Marchand, 26, a seamstress working in a silk workshop on the slopes of Croix. Brown hair, hazel eyes, a shy smile. She lived alone, in a small maid's room on the 6th floor of a building on Rue Bordeaux Street, March 15, 1972. Sophie didn't show up for work. Her employer, Madame Chevalier, frowned. Sophie had never missed a day. Never. She was a serious girl, punctual, hardworking, saving every penny so that one day she could open her own dress shop. Maybe she's sick, one of her coworkers suggested. But Sophie didn't have a telephone. None of the girls who lived in those cramped attic rooms did. So Madame Chevalier waited one day, then two, then three. On the fourth day, she went to the police. At the 4th Arrondissement police station, Inspector Morrow took her statement with tired indifference. He was a weary man, with dark circles under his eyes and the faint smell of cold coffee clinging to him. Name: Sophie Marchand. Age: 22. Occupation: seamstress. Family: orphan, no known relatives in Lyon. Morrow lifted his eyes from his notepad. Any recent problems? A boyfriend? Debts? No, nothing. She's a quiet girl, discreet. The inspector sighed. He had seen this story play out dozens of times. A young woman, alone in a big city, no family, no ties. Listen, Madame Chevalier. These young women, they often leave without warning. A lover in Paris, a new job, or just the urge to change their lives. She'll probably come back in a few weeks. But all her things are still in her room, the woman protested. Her coat, her savings, everything. Then maybe she had an emergency, or she'll return for them soon. I'll open a file, but honestly, there isn't much we can do right now. And that was that. The case was filed away, 3 lines in a dusty register. Sophie Marchand became a statistic. No one yet knew she had become much more than that. Rumors spread quickly in a neighborhood like Croix. They drifted from balcony to balcony, whispered in line at the bakery, traded between drags of cigarettes outside the factories. Did you hear? The little seamstress has vanished. You mean the one from Rue Bordeaux? Yes, just disappeared, poof. Fingers snapped to emphasize the mystery. She probably ran off with a man. Or maybe she was sick of Lyon. You know how young people are these days. My sister-in-law swears she saw her the day before near Place Croix. She looked fine, normal. Normal until she was. And then someone, no one remembered exactly who, made a remark that stuck in everyone's minds. It's strange, isn't it, that this happens right when that smell started around here. An uneasy silence followed. Because yes, it was strange, but linking a disappearance to a foul odor seemed ridiculous, superstitious. The kind of thing peasants from the Middle Ages might believe, not modern people living in 1972. So they shrugged and changed the subject. But the idea had been planted, a tiny seed of doubt, almost invisible, one that would soon grow into a forest of terror. Because Sophie Marchand hadn't gone anywhere. She was still in the neighborhood, in the cellar of the modern butcher shop. In pieces. Wrapped. Labeled. And the next morning, Marcel Fournier opened his shop with the same cheerful smile as always, selling his special cutlets at a discount. Marcel woke every day at 4:30 a.m. It's the butcher's hour, he used to say, when the city still sleeps, the streets are empty, and one can work in peace. He would descend into the cellar through a narrow staircase behind the counter. The stone steps were worn smooth by time, slick with moisture. At the bottom stood a reinforced metal door with a double lock. Inside lay his workshop. Steel hooks dangled from the ceiling. A stainless steel table stood in the center of the room. Knives of every size hung neatly on the wall, sharpened to perfection, gleaming like surgical instruments. In the corner, a large industrial freezer hummed softly, glowing with a pale, icy light. And the smell down here, the smell was pure, concentrated, a blend of raw meat, dried blood, industrial disinfectant, and something else. Something indefinable that Marcel had grown to love. The smell of a job well done. He put on his heavy rubber apron, the one he never wore upstairs, the one stained a dark brown red despite countless washings. He turned on the radio, France Inter, the morning news murmuring in the background. And he began his day. Sophie Marchand had provided enough meat for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if he was careful. The prime cuts, thighs, back, were already wrapped and labeled in the freezer. Top quality beef, read the handwritten labels. Tender veal. Farm pork. The offal too risky, too recognizable, he threw away. The roan swallowed everything without asking questions. But Marcel was already thinking ahead. He needed a new supplier. He had developed a method, almost a science. He looked for specific prey, solitary, unattached, invisible. Big cities like Lyon were full of such living ghosts, people who slipped through the cracks of society. No close family, no real friends, unstable jobs, or none at all. The kind of person who could disappear for weeks before anyone, a landlord worried about unpaid rent, or an irritated employer, would finally begin to ask questions. And even then, the police did nothing. They left, maybe they'll come back next case. Marcel would spot them during his evening walks. He loved walking through Lyon after closing his shop. He watched, he listened, he learned. La Croix was perfect for this. A maze of dark alleys, endless staircases, secret passages between old buildings, places where no one looked twice, where a scream would die, swallowed by the echo of ancient stone. His second target was Elaine Roussel, 34 years old. Factory worker, divorced, a functioning alcoholic. He lived in a dingy little studio on Rue des Tables Claudians, squeezed between a noisy brasserie and a carpenter's workshop. Every evening, he stopped at the Café du Commerce for 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 glasses of cheap red wine. Then he would stagger home and collapse on his bed, shoes still on. Marcel had watched him for 2 weeks. Perfect routine. Perfect solitude. Perfect prey. On April 23, 1972, a cold, rainy Thursday night, Marcel waited in the shadows of Rue des Tables Claudians. He wore a long dark coat and a cap pulled low over his forehead. In his gloved hands, he gripped a piece of lead pipe, heavy and cold. At 10:45 p.m., Elaine appeared just as expected. He was humming a vulgar song, stumbling over the wet cobblestones. The pounding rain drowned out every sound. Marcel waited until he passed the dark entrance of an abandoned building. Then he struck one clean, precise blow to the back of the head. Elaine crumpled soundlessly, swallowed by the darkness. Marcel dragged the unconscious body to his van, parked 2 streets away. On the side, the painted sign read, "Modern Butchery, Quality Meats." No one paid any attention. A butcher's van in a working-class neighborhood at 11 p.m. Normal, ordinary, invisible. 30 minutes later, Elaine Roussel was descending the narrow stone staircase into the cellar of the modern butcher shop. Not on his feet. Not conscious, but in pieces. Marcel had perfected his process. He no longer killed for pleasure, if he ever had. It had become mechanical, efficient. The stunning, quick, silent, far from prying eyes. The transport in the van, always late at night, always along the least traveled streets. The transformation in the cellar, with the same precision he used to butcher a cow. Because deep down, he told himself, what's the difference? Meat is meat. The wrapping white paper. The handwritten labels neatly placed in the freezer beside the real pork, real beef, real veal he also bought to avoid suspicion, to keep up appearances. The selling always with a smile. Good morning, Madame Peltier. How are you today? Very well, Monsieur Fournier. What do you recommend for Sunday? I just received a magnificent roast this morning, very tender, melts in your mouth. You'll love it. Oh, wonderful, I'll take it. Perfect transaction. And while Madame Peltier walked home, delighted with her carefully wrapped package, happy to have found such a beautiful cut at such a good price, Marcel counted his bills and was already thinking about his next hunt. May 1972. 3 disappearances now. Sophie Marchand, Elaine Roussel, and Eric Fontaine, a 28-year-old newspaper seller who lived alone in a small attic room, whose absence went unnoticed for 10 whole days. 10 days. That said everything about urban loneliness, thought Inspector Morrow, flipping through the 3 thin case files on his desk. 3 people vanished in 2 months. No bodies. No witnesses. No apparent motive. Technically, there weren't even crimes. Not yet. Just disappearances. And people disappeared all the time. But 3 in 2 months, in the same neighborhood. Morrow lit a cigarette and stared out the window of the police station. La Croix stretched before him, its red-tiled rooftops gleaming under the May sun. A beautiful district, quiet, family-oriented. So why did he feel that knot in his stomach? He called in 2 officers for a meeting. I want you to go door to door in Croix, discreetly, ask questions. Did anyone see anything unusual, strange cars, suspicious people? You think there's a connection between the 3, Inspector? Morrow took a slow drag of his cigarette. I don't know, but my gut says yes, and my gut is rarely wrong. He was right. But it was already far too late for Sophie, Elaine, and Eric. Much too late. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood apartments, families were sitting down for dinner. In the Peltier household, Rue Berdo. Mammon, this roast is delicious, isn't it? It's Monsieur Fournier who recommended it. I don't know where he finds his meat, but it's exceptional. It melts in your mouth. Have some more, my dear, there's plenty. Across the way in the Thibault family, on Monte de la Grande Côte. Papa, can you pass me the cutlets? Here you go. Son, eat well, you're growing. These cutlets taste strange. They don't taste like usual. Strange comment, I don't know. Softer, more tender, it's because they are higher quality. The new butcher knows what he's doing. At the Garnier household, Rue des Tables Claudians. This sausage is to die for. It's true it has a unique flavor. I'll buy more tomorrow. The children love it. Chewing, swallowing, satisfaction. Across the entire neighborhood, families ate and Marcel Fournier smiled. But Marcel had made a mistake, a small mistake. The kind of mistake that seems insignificant at the moment, but that will change everything, because someone was watching. Someone had seen. and that person would soon understand the horrible truth. Thomas Beaumont, age 9. Son of Madame Beaumont, the widow who had been the first to notice the strange smell. A curious, intelligent boy with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He loved playing detective. He had read every Arsène Lupin book, every Sherlock Holmes that the municipal library owned. He imagined mysteries everywhere. The neighbor's cat disappearing at night, surely an international spy. The mailman who always delivered at the same hour, certainly carrying a coded message. The lady on the third floor who received frequent visitors, probably a smuggler. But this time, it was not imagination. Thomas had noticed things, small things, details that adults ignored because they were too busy with life, bills, worries. He had noticed that Monsieur Fournier always took out his van at night, late after closing, when the streets were empty. He had noticed the van always returned heavier than it had left. He had noticed it sagging on its suspension. He had noticed that the bags thrown behind the butcher shop smelled strange, not like ordinary butcher waste, something stronger, more human. And he had noticed that the people who disappeared all lived near the butcher shop. On Saturday night, May 15, Thomas begged his mother to let him stay up late. "It's the weekend, Mom, please." Madame Beaumont sighed and relented. "Okay, but to bed at 10, not a minute later." 10 p.m. Thomas crept to his room. He turned off the light, waited for his mother to fall asleep. She snored lightly, a reassuring sound that filled the apartment. Then, silent as a cat, he slipped to the kitchen window that faced the street. He settled on a chair, wrapped in a blanket, and watched. 10:30 p.m., the street was empty. A few lights shone in scattered windows. A cat crossed the road. 11 p.m., a couple returned from a noisy dinner. 11:30 p.m., all lights went out. The neighborhood slept. 11:45 p.m., the door of the modern butcher shop opened. Thomas straightened, heart racing. Marcel Fournier emerged. But it wasn't the daytime Marcel Fournier, the smiling butcher in his white apron, giving cooking advice. This was a different man, dressed in black, cap pulled low, leather gloves. He climbed into his van and started it, headlights still off. Only when he turned the corner did he finally switch them on. Where was he going? Thomas waited 1 hour, 2 hours. At 1:30 a.m. the van returned. This time Thomas saw Marcel parked right in front of the butcher shop. He stepped out, looked around. Thomas froze, holding his breath, then watched Marcel open the rear doors. There was something inside, a large, heavy sack. Marcel lifted it with effort, hoisting it onto his shoulder. The sack moved, a faint movement, a spasm. Thomas felt a chill run through him. There was someone inside, someone alive. Marcel carried the sack into the shop. He closed the door. The cellar light switched on, visible through the small window facing the street. Thomas remained paralyzed. His child's mind struggled to understand what he had just seen. Tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps it was no. There was no rational explanation. He had seen a man take someone and carry them into his butcher shop in the middle of the night. He had to tell someone. The next morning, Sunday, Thomas was exhausted. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moving sack. He heard the dull thud it made when Marcel had set it on the ground. What was in that sack? He had to tell his mother, the police, someone. But what if no one believed him? He was only 9. Adults never take children seriously. You have too much imagination, Thomas. You had a nightmare. Stop making up stories. And what if he was wrong? What if it was just imagination? What if Marcel Fournier was just a normal butcher transporting, what? Meat at 1 a.m. in a moving sack. No, he had not been wrong. Thomas made a decision, a terrible decision for a 9-year-old. He would investigate himself. In the following days, Thomas became Marcel Fournier's shadow. He lingered near the butcher shop after school, pretending to play marbles with imaginary friends. He watched the customers come and go. He listened to conversations. "Good morning, Monsieur Fournier. I'd like a kilo of your veal, please." "Of course, madame. I just received a beautiful piece this morning, very tender." "Received from where?" Thomas knew delivery trucks usually arrived in the morning. He had seen them at the other shops. The baker received his flour at 6, the grocer his vegetables at 7. But no truck ever stopped in front of the modern butcher shop. So where did the meat come from? Thomas began to write everything down in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. He recorded every detail. Monday, May 22. Fournier leaves at 11:30 p.m., returns at 1:15 a.m. van full. Tuesday, May 23. No night trip, many customers during the day. Wednesday, May 24. Left at midnight, returned at 2 a.m. sack in the van. Thursday, May 25. Fournier throws bags near the bins. Very strong smells, flies everywhere. The sacks, that was the key. The sacks Marcel dumped behind the butcher shop near the refuse containers. They smelled so bad even the stray dogs avoided them. Thomas made another terrible decision. He would look inside the sacks. Wednesday, May 31, late hours. Thomas waited until his mother fell asleep. He dressed all in black like Marcel, like a real detective. He slipped a flashlight into his pocket and crept silently down the building stairs. The street was deserted. His footsteps echoed on the cobbles. Every sound made him jump. His heart pounded so hard he was sure the whole neighborhood could hear it. He slipped into the alley behind the butcher shop. Here the darkness was complete, no street lamp, only the faint moonlight filtering between the buildings. The smell was unbearable. Thomas pressed his hand to his mouth to keep from vomiting. The sacks were there, 3 large black bags piled against the wall. He approached the first, his hands trembled. He switched on his torch and aimed it at the bag. The plastic was translucent in places. At first he saw something white, bones. Long, thin bones, too long for pork, too thin for beef. He moved the light higher and then he saw it. A finger, a human finger, the nail still varnished with chipped red polish. Thomas screamed. The sound rolled across the cobbles, throwing wild shadows on the walls. He stumbled back, tripped, fell. He needed to run, to shout, to tell someone, but no sound came from his throat. Terror had paralyzed him. Then he heard it, a metallic noise, a door opening, the cellar door. Marcel Fournier had come out, and he had heard the noise. Thomas sprang up and ran. He ran like he had never run in his life. His lungs burned, his legs shook. He heard heavy, fast footsteps behind him. Marcel was chasing him. "Kid, stop, I know it's you. Stop right now." Thomas turned a corner, then another. He knew the neighborhood by heart, every alley, every stairway, every hiding place. He slipped through a narrow passage between 2 buildings, too tight for an adult. He heard Marcel curse, try to force his way in, then give up. The footsteps faded. Thomas stayed huddled in the dark, shaking and silently crying. He had seen. He knew. Marcel Fournier was a monster, and now the monster knew that he knew. Thomas waited an hour in his hiding place before daring to come out. He went home across the roofs, climbing gutters and balconies just like in the films he'd read about. When he finally slid into bed, the sun was beginning to rise over Lyon, and Thomas Beaumont, 9 years old, knew his life would never be the same because he had discovered the modern butcher's secret, a secret that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But for now he had to survive, and to survive he had to speak. The next morning Thomas woke with a resolute decision. He would not go to school. He would go straight to the police station. But when he came down for breakfast, his mother awaited him with an anxious face. "Thomas, Monsieur Fournier came by this morning. He says you were hanging around his butcher shop last night, rummaging through his bins." It was true. Cold fear flowed through Thomas. Marcel had already been by to check, to threaten, to make sure the child would not speak. Thomas felt his mother's gaze weigh on him. He wanted to tell her everything, but the words stuck in his throat because he knew. If Marcel learned the boy had talked, his mother would be next, the next to disappear, the next to end up in a black sack behind the butcher's shop, the next to be sold in pieces to the neighbors. "I was looking for my ball, Mama. It fell near the bins, that's all." Madame Beaumont sighed, relieved. "All right, but don't do it again. Monsieur Fournier was very kind not to be angry. He even gave you this." She held out a small package wrapped in white paper. "Sausage. For you." Thomas looked at the parcel as if it were a venomous snake. He knew exactly what it really contained. Marcel Fournier was sending him a message, a very clear one. "I know who you are. I know where you live. I can reach you whenever I want." Thomas took the package with a trembling hand. "Thank you, Mama. I'll be late." For school, he threw the sausage into the first trash bin he came across on the street. Then he didn't walk toward school but toward the police station. He was afraid, terribly afraid, but he had no choice. If no one stopped Marcel Fournier, other people would disappear. Other families would unknowingly eat their neighbors. Other children would become orphans. At the police station of the 4th District, a secretary looked at him with surprise. "You're lost, little one." "No, madame, I need to speak to a policeman. It's urgent. It's about the disappearances." The secretary furrowed her brows. "What disappearances?" "People who have disappeared in Croix-Rousse. Sophie Marchand, Elaine Roussel, Eric Fontaine, I know where they are." The secretary hesitated. She might have sent him back home, telling him it was just children's stories. When Inspector Morrow came out of his office, he had heard. "Let him in." The secretary obeyed. Thomas found himself in a small office cluttered with files and empty coffee cups. Inspector Morrow sat across from him and lit a cigarette. "So, my boy, what's your name?" "Thomas Beaumont. I live on Rue Berdow, and you say you know something about the disappearances." Thomas nodded. He took a deep breath and began to tell everything. Marcel Fournier's nightly trips, the van returning heavy, the sack that moved, the bones in the bins, the finger with red nail polish. Morrow listened, his face growing increasingly grave. He didn't smile. He didn't say it was nonsense. He took notes, many notes. When Thomas finished, Morrow stubbed out his cigarette and leaned toward him. "Thomas, what you're telling me is very serious. Very serious. If it's true, Marcel Fournier is a murderer, perhaps the worst Lyon has ever known. But if it's not true, if you imagined all of this, you could ruin the life of an innocent man. So I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw? Thomas looked him straight in the eyes. He thought of Sophie Marchand, who wanted to open her own shop, of Elaine Roussel, returning from the cafe singing, of Eric Fontaine, who sold newspapers every morning, of all those people nobody would ever search for because they were alone, because they were invisible. Yes, Inspector, I'm certain. I saw a human finger in the butcher shop bins, and I saw Mr. Fournier bring someone in a sack, someone alive. Morrow stood up. Stay here, don't move. He left the office, and Thomas heard him giving orders in the hallway. Gather the team now. We need a search warrant for the modern butcher on Rue Bordeaux and call the coroner. We might need him. On June 1, 1972, at precisely 2 p.m., 3 police cars parked in front of the modern butcher. Inspector Morrow exited first, followed by 6 uniformed officers and the coroner, Dr. Leblanc, a thin man with an austere face, who had seen more dead than most people ever would. On the street, passers-by stopped, windows opened, whispers began. What's happening? Why is the police here? Is it the butcher? What did he do? Marcel Fournier was serving a customer when the door swung open violently. He looked up, his eternal smile frozen on his lips. Inspector Morrow, what a surprise. What brings you here? Morrow brandished the search warrant. Marcel Fournier, we have a warrant to search your establishment and your residence. You have the right to be present during the search or to withdraw. Which do you choose? Marcel did not move. His face had turned white, not white with fear, no, white with restrained rage. A warrant? Why? On what grounds? On the basis of credible testimony regarding recent disappearances in the neighborhood. Now step aside, or I'll have you arrested for obstruction of justice. Marcel stepped back slowly. His hands gripped the counter so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Go ahead, search. You'll find nothing. I'm an honest butcher, a respectable merchant. You'll see very soon and you'll regret this intrusion. Morrow did not reply. He signaled to his men. Start from the top, the shop, the storage, the apartment, and be thorough. For an hour the officers searched methodically. They opened every drawer, every cupboard, every box. They inspected the cold room behind the shop. They found meat, lots of meat, but nothing unusual. Beef, pork, veal, lamb. Everything properly labeled, everything seemingly normal. Marcel stood near the counter, arms crossed, his smile slowly returning. So, Inspector, found anything? Can I get back to work? Morrow did not respond. He scanned the shop. Something was off, something he couldn't identify. Then he saw it, a small stain on the floor near the counter. A brownish stain, almost invisible on the dark wood. He knelt down and passed his finger on it. Blood, old but blood nonetheless. Dr. Leblanc, come see this. The coroner approached, examined the stain. It's blood, yes, but Inspector, it's a butcher shop. There's blood everywhere. It proves nothing. Morrow stood up. No, but it justifies continuing. He turned to Marcel. Where is the access to the cellar? Marcel hesitated only a second, but Morrow saw him. The cellar. There's nothing in the cellar, just old furniture and boxes. I asked where the access was. Marcel pointed with his finger to a door behind the counter. But I warn you, it's dangerous. The steps are slippery. If one of your men gets hurt, I will not be responsible. Morrow opened the door. A smell immediately rose. A smell he recognized instantly. The smell of death. Not fresh, not putrid, but present, persistent, undeniable. He turned to Marcel. His eyes had hardened. Mr. Fournier, I place you under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be held against you. No, no, you don't have the right. I haven't done anything. Take him. Two officers seized Marcel by the arms. He struggled, screaming and swearing. You're making a mistake, a terrible mistake. I'm innocent, you'll regret this. I'll take you to court. Do you hear me? I'll destroy you. But Moreau no longer listened. He was already descending the stairs toward the cellar, followed by Dr. Leblanc and 3 other officers. The steps were indeed slippery, wet, cold. The light was dim, just a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Moreau turned on his flashlight, and what he saw made him stop dead. The cellar was immense, far larger than the shop above. The walls were lined with white tiles like in a laboratory or slaughterhouse. Steel hooks hung from the ceiling. Some were empty, others still bore traces, dried blood, pieces of flesh. A stainless steel table occupied the center. On it were tools, butcher knives, cleavers, meat grinders, all meticulously arranged, all perfectly sharpened. Against the back wall, a huge industrial freezer purred softly. Moreau approached it slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the handle. He looked at Leblanc. The doctor nodded, ready. Moreau opened the freezer, and hell revealed itself. Dozens of packages, all carefully wrapped in white paper, all labeled beef, veal, pork, lamb. Moreau took one at random, unwrapped it cautiously. It was not beef, it was a human leg cut at the thigh. The skin was blue, gray, frozen, but recognizable, undeniably human. Leblanc took another package, a shoulder another, a torso cut in 2 another, ribs, arms, hands. My God, murmured one of the officers before rushing to the stairs to vomit. Moreau continued opening the packages methodically, professionally, but his face had turned ashen. How many, doctor? How many bodies? Leblanc examined the pieces, counting, cataloging mentally. At least 7, maybe more. We'll have to examine everything in detail, but I'd say between 7 and 10 different people. 10 people, 10 lives transformed into meat, sold, consumed. Moreau felt bile rise in his throat. He had seen horrible things in his career, murders, rapes, abused children. But this surpassed everything. It was beyond horror, beyond humanity. He went back upstairs. Marcel Fournier was handcuffed to a chair, 2 officers watching him. When he saw Moreau's face, his smile disappeared permanently. You are a monster, said Moreau in a cold voice. An absolute monster, Marcel didn't answer. He stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. Moreau leaned toward him. How many people have you killed? Silence. How many people have you cut up and sold as meat? Silence. How many families ate their neighbors without knowing because of you? Marcel slowly raised his head, and for the first time Moreau saw something in his eyes. Not remorse, not fear, something worse, pride. They all said my meat was the best they ever tasted, all of them without exception. I was the best butcher in Lyon, the best. And do you know why? Because I wasted nothing, not a gram. Everything was used, everything had value. Moreau stepped back, disgusted. You're sick and insane. Marcel let out a dry laugh. Sick, insane. No, Inspector, just practical. Do you know how many people disappear every year in big cities? Thousands of people nobody cares about, nobody looks for. Why let it all go to waste? Why not give it a use, a purpose? I did them a service. I transformed them into something useful, something people enjoyed. You killed them, cut them up, sold them. Yes, and so what? They were alone, invisible. Now they fed families, gave pleasure, had more impact than they ever would have alive. Morrow closed his eyes. He wanted to strike this man, to beat him until he begged. But he did not, because he was a cop, because there were rules, because justice had to follow its course. Take him and call the prosecutor. We will need reinforcements, many reinforcements. While Marcel Fournier was being led, handcuffed at the wrist, to the police car, the neighborhood residents began to understand. The murmurs became screams, cries, howls of horror, because they all realized at the same time. The meat they had bought, eaten, loved, it was not beef, it was not pork. It was their neighbors, their friends, their acquaintances. Madame Peltier collapsed in the street, vomiting the lunch she had just eaten. Monsieur Thibault began to cry like a child. Madame Garnier screamed again and again, a primal scream that seemed never to stop. Families came out of their apartments, looking at each other with growing horror. We all ate. My God, what have we done? And in the middle of the chaos, Thomas Beaumont watched the scene from his apartment window. He was only 9 years old, but he had just understood something that most adults spend a lifetime trying to understand. Sometimes monsters do not hide in the darkness. Sometimes they smile, they joke, they offer free sausage. Sometimes monsters look exactly like normal people. And that is the most terrifying thing. The weeks following Marcel Fournier's arrest were a waking nightmare for Lyon. The media seized the case with a sick voracity. The Butcher of Lyon proclaimed Le Progrès on the front page. The anthropophage of Croix claimed Francois. The cannibal shopkeeper screamed Paris Match. Journalists poured in from all over France, from all over Europe, transforming the peaceful Croix neighborhood into a media circus. Cameras everywhere, microphones held toward every resident, unbearable questions. How do you feel knowing you ate human flesh? Will you ever be able to eat meat again? How do you live with this guilt? Guilt. The word came back constantly, as if the residents were guilty, as if buying meat from your butcher was a crime, as if trusting someone was a fault. Many could not bear it. Madame Peltier had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. Monsieur Thibault closed his shoemaking shop and left Lyon without warning anyone. The Garnier family moved in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind, unable to remain another minute in that cursed neighborhood. Those who stayed had to learn to live with it. With the looks of others, with the whispers, with the pointing fingers. They were the people who had eaten, the involuntary cannibals, the victims who, despite themselves, had become accomplices. The modern butcher shop was sealed, its windows bricked up, but that was not enough, because every time someone passed by, they remembered, imagined what had happened in that cellar. They remembered Marcel's smiles, heard his voice. You will love it, very tender, melting. The investigation progressed methodically. Dr. Leblanc and his team spent weeks examining the remains found in the freezer, reconstructing, identifying. It was a nightmarish task. Many pieces were impossible to identify with certainty. No head, no complete hand. Marcel had been meticulous in his destruction, but some clues remained. An appendectomy scar, a faded old tattoo, a poorly healed fracture. Little by little, the victims were identified. Sophie Marchand was identified thanks to an old fracture of the left wrist, documented in her medical file. Elaine Roussel, thanks to a metal pin in his leg, a reminder of a motorcycle accident 10 years earlier. Eric Fontaine, thanks to his rare blood type and a congenital toe deformity. But there were other victims, victims whose disappearances had never been reported, ghosts, invisibles. A man in his 50s, probably homeless. A woman around 30, possibly a prostitute. A 16-year-old boy, maybe a runaway. In total, Dr. Leblanc confirmed 11 victims. 11 people, cut up, wrapped, sold. But this figure was a minimum because not all the pieces were in the freezer. Many had already been sold, consumed, digested, disappeared forever. The true number of victims would likely remain unknown. 20. Marcel Fournier refused to speak. He had remained silent since his arrest, except for a few terrifying phrases at the police station. Not a word for his lawyer, not even a glance at the investigators. He remained seated in his cell, motionless, eyes empty, as if his mind had retreated to a place no one could reach. The trial opened on October 15, 1972, at the Lyon courthouse. The courtroom was packed, journalists from all over the world, psychiatrists, criminologists, morbidly curious people who had queued all night to get a seat. The families of the victims, those who had been identified at least, and the residents of Croix-Rousse, those who had bought, those who had eaten, those who needed to know why their smiling butcher had become the worst monster Lyon had ever known. Marcel Fournier entered the courtroom framed by 4 gendarmes. He wore a gray suit, a white shirt, a black tie. His hair was neatly combed. He looked like an accountant, like a professor, like anyone. Maybe that was the most terrifying part. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a normal, ordinary, banal man. The president of the court, Judge Bertrand, an austere man of about 60, opened the session. Marcel Fournier, you are accused of 11 premeditated murders, desecration of corpses, and fraudulent commercialization of human flesh. How do you plead? Silence. Mr. Fournier, I ask you again, how do you plead? Silence. Marcel's lawyer, Maître Durin, a young man visibly uncomfortable, stood up. My client invokes his right to remain silent, Your Honor. He does not wish to plead at this time. The trial continued without him. The prosecution methodically laid out the evidence, the testimonies, the expert reports. The prosecutor, Maître Legrand, a woman in her 50s with a steely gaze, presented the facts with surgical precision. The nightly outings, the kidnappings, the cellar, the freezer, the packages, the victims, 11 human beings, 11 lives turned into merchandise. The witnesses came forward. Inspector Moreau recounted the discovery. Dr. Leblanc presented the autopsy results. Then Thomas Beaumont took the stand. He was now 10 years older, more mature, but his eyes still held a shadow that would never leave. He recounted what he had seen: the moving bag, the finger with the red nail polish, the chase through the alleys. His voice did not tremble. He simply told the truth. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. When he finished, Marcel Fournier looked at him for the first time since the beginning of the trial. A long, intense look, impossible to read. Thomas held that look. Then Marcel smiled. A slight, almost imperceptible smile, as if to say, "Well done, kid, you won." Thomas stepped down from the stand. He did not smile because he knew there were no winners in this story, only losers, all of them. Next came the psychiatrists. They had examined Marcel for weeks, tested, analyzed, probed. Their conclusion was unanimous. Marcel Fournier was not insane, not in the legal sense. He perfectly understood the difference between right and wrong. He knew what he was doing was forbidden, condemnable, monstrous. He had simply chosen to do it anyway because he wanted to, because he could, because it served his interests. "This man is a psychopath," explained Dr. Renard, a renowned psychiatrist from Paris. "He feels no empathy, no remorse, no guilt. For him, other human beings are not people. They are objects, resources, things that can be used according to his needs. He killed these people with the same indifference he would have used to slaughter a pig, less even, because he probably would have paid for a pig." The room remained silent. Then someone stood up. A woman in her 30s, thin, eyes red. It was Isabelle Marchand, Sophie's cousin, the only family she had left. She pointed at Marcel. "Monster, soulless monster, how could you? How could you do that to Sophie? She was kind, she had done nothing to you. She just wanted to live her life, open her shop, be happy. And you. She could not finish. She collapsed in sobs. They had to take her out, but those words lingered in the air, an unshakable accusation. The prosecutor resumed speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have just heard the facts. You have seen the evidence, you have heard the witnesses, you have listened to the experts. There is no possible doubt. Marcel Fournier killed at least 11 people, probably more. He cut them up like meat. He sold them to their own neighbors, to their friends, to their family." She paused, letting the weight of her words resonate. "This is a crime beyond comprehension, a crime that forces us to ask what it means to be human. Because Marcel Fournier crossed a line that even the worst criminals hesitate to cross. He did not just kill, he dehumanized. He transformed people into products, beings into things, and he did it without remorse, without hesitation, with method, with efficiency, with professionalism." She turned to the jury. "I will not ask you for pity, because Marcel Fournier showed no pity to his victims. I will not ask you for mercy because he showed no mercy to Sophie Marchand when she begged for her life, to Alain Roussel when he woke in that cellar, to Eric Fontaine when he realized what was going to happen to him. I will only ask you for justice. Justice for the 11 identified victims. Justice for those who will never be identified. Justice for an entire neighborhood traumatized forever." The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of overwhelming testimonies, of irrefutable evidence, of horrifying revelations. Marcel Fournier did not say a word, not a single word. His lawyer pleaded insanity without conviction, knowing it was lost in advance. The jury deliberated for 60 hours. When they returned, their faces said it all. Guilty on all counts. Premeditated murders, desecration of corpses, fraudulent commercialization, and an accusation specially added for him. Cannibalism by proxy. The sentence fell like a hammer blow. Life imprisonment, without possibility of parole. Marcel Fournier would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would die in prison. When the judge pronounced the verdict, Marcel did not flinch. He stood up calmly, allowed himself to be handcuffed, began to leave the courtroom. But at the last moment, just before crossing the door, he turned around, looked at the audience, and spoke for the first and only time during the trial. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. Do you know what's funny? They all asked again, all of them. Week after week, Madame Peltier came twice a week. Monsieur Thibault bought 3 kilos each time. The Garnier family organized dinners with my meat. They said it was the best they had ever tasted. And you know what? They were right, because it was the best, the most tender, the most flavorful, the most human. He smiled, a smile that chilled the blood of everyone present. So yes, condemn me, lock me up, throw away the key, but never forget one thing. You all ate, you all enjoyed it, you all asked for more. And somewhere deep inside you, in that little dark corner you refuse to look at, you still wonder what it really tasted like, why it was so good, and if you asked for more, would you like it again? The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one breathed, then someone vomited, then another, then cries, tears, chaos. The gendarmes dragged Marcel out of the courtroom as he laughed. A dry, mechanical, joyless laugh. The laugh of a man who had already won, because he knew that those words would remain, that they would haunt, that they would gnaw forever. Marcel Fournier was transferred to Beaumet prison in Marseille. Solitary cell, constant surveillance. They feared he would be lynched by other inmates, even in prison, even among murderers and rapists. There were lines not to cross, and Marcel had crossed them all. But strangely, he was never touched. Perhaps because the other inmates feared him. Not physically. Marcel was not particularly imposing, but there was something in his eyes, something empty, something dead, that said this man was no longer entirely human, that he had become something else. He spent 17 years in Beaumet, 17 years without incident, without complaint, without problem. A model prisoner. He worked in the library, read a lot, mostly cookbooks. No one understood why the guards allowed him to do so. Perhaps because it was easier to leave him alone. Perhaps because they too feared what they would see if they looked too long into his empty eyes. In 1989, Marcel Fournier died of pancreatic cancer. He was 57 years old. His final words, reported by the prison chaplain, were simple. I lived well, I did what I wanted, I regret nothing. No remorse, no repentance, even facing death, even facing eternity. Marcel Fournier remained what he had always been, a predator, a monster, an anomaly of humanity. He was buried in the indigent section of the Marseille cemetery. No tombstone, no name, just a number. Authorities feared his grave would become a site of morbid pilgrimage, or worse, a sanctuary for other monsters who would see in him inspiration. So they erased it, as if they could erase what he had done. As if forgetting could heal the wounds he had inflicted. But Marcel Fournier cannot be erased, because his legacy was not in a grave. It was in nightmares, in memories, in the broken lives he left behind. Croix never truly recovered. The neighborhood changed. The old residents left one by one, unable to live with the weight of what had happened. New residents arrived, attracted by ridiculously low rents, but the rumors circulated, the stories passed on. The Butcher of Lyon, the anthropophage, the smiling monster selling death. The modern butcher shop remained condemned for years. No one wanted to touch it, as if the evil that had reigned there was contagious, as if the stones themselves were cursed. In 1985, the city finally decided to demolish it. A controversial decision. Some thought it should be preserved as a memorial. A reminder of this. which can happen when one stops seeing humanity in others. Others wanted to erase it completely, to act as if it had never happened. The demolition won. But when the workers began to break the walls of the cellar, they found something. Something the police had missed. Inscriptions on the white walls carved with a knife, names, dates. Marcel had kept a record, an inventory of his victims. 15 names, 15 dates, 15 lives, 4 more than what the police had identified. 4 people whose families would never know what had happened to them. 4 additional ghosts to haunt Lyon. The authorities tried to keep the discovery secret, but in a city like Lyon, secrets never stay secret for long. The information leaked. The newspaper seized it. The nightmare began again. Thomas Beaumont was now 22 years old. He was studying criminology at the University of Paris. His childhood experience had obviously marked him, but instead of breaking him, it had shaped him. He wanted to understand how a man could become a monster, to understand how society could allow it, to understand how to prevent it from happening again. When he learned about the discovery of the inscriptions, he returned to Lyon for the first time in years. He stood before the ruins of the modern butcher shop, watching the workers clear the rubble. And he thought of that night, 10 years earlier, when he had seen the moving bag, when he had realized that monsters really existed, when he had decided to speak despite the fear. A journalist recognized him, approached. "Mr. Beaumont, may I ask you a few questions?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. The journalist took out his notebook. "How do you feel coming back here?" "How do I feel?" Thomas looked at the ruins, sad, angry. "Relieved too, I suppose. Relieved that it's over. But do you know what haunts me the most? It's not what I saw that night. It's not the finger in the bag. It's not the chase. It's the fact that he was right." The journalist frowned. "Right about what?" Thomas turned toward him. His eyes were dark, haunted. "Marcel Fournier said at the trial that everyone had asked for more, that everyone had enjoyed it, and it's true. My own mother bought from him every week. She said it was the best meat she had ever tasted. And for years after his arrest, she could no longer eat meat. She vomited at the very thought. Not because of what he had done, but because of the fact that she had enjoyed it." He paused. "That is Marcel Fournier's legacy. Not the murders, not the bodies, but the doubt he planted in the minds of all those who bought from him. The doubt that says maybe I am a monster too. Maybe I enjoyed something I should never have enjoyed. And that doubt never goes away. It stays, it grows, it rots from the inside." The journalist frantically took notes. "And you, how have you lived with that?" Thomas smiled sadly. "I became a criminologist. I study psychopaths. I try to understand how such things can be prevented. But the truth is that I still do not sleep very well. I still have nightmares, and sometimes when I see a butcher in the street, my heart starts beating faster. My body remembers, even if my mind tries to forget." Years passed. Lyon continued to live, to breathe, to grow. The Croix gentrified. Artists moved in. Trendy cafes replaced the old butcher shops. Tourists came to admire the trables and cobbled slopes, unaware of what had happened here, unaware that under their feet in these picturesque streets, a man had hunted human prey for months. But those who knew did not forget the survivors, the victims' families, the residents who had lived through that time. They gathered every year on June 1st, anniversary of the arrest. Not to celebrate, just to remember, to honor those who had died, to remind each other that they were not alone with their pain. Madame Beaumont died in 1995, at the age of 90. Until the end, she never ate meat again. Thomas was at her bedside. In her last moments of lucidity, she took his hand. "You have been brave, my son. You did what was right. I am proud of you." Then more softly, almost like a confession, "But I should have sensed, I should have known this smell, this terrible smell. I was the first to feel it. I should have understood." "Mom, no, you couldn't have known. No one could have known," he whispered. "If we had looked, if we had really looked instead of making excuses, if we had asked questions instead of accepting easy answers, Sophie Marchand might still be alive, and Elaine and Eric and all the others." She closed her eyes. Thomas held her hand until she passed, and he wept. Not only for his mother, but for all those who carried the weight of guilt they did not deserve. In 2010, a documentary was made about the Marcel Fournier case, the Butcher of Lyon. It was broadcast on France I and provoked a national debate. How could they have let it happen? Why had the police not acted sooner? What did it say about French society at the time? Important questions, necessary questions, but also questions that came 40 years too late for the victims. Thomas Beaumont participated in the documentary. He was now 47 years old, professor of criminology, author of several books on serial killers, recognized expert. But when he spoke of Marcel Fournier, it was always with that shadow in his eyes. That shadow that never left. During the interview, the director asked him the question everyone wanted to ask. If you could go back in time, what would you change? Thomas thought for a long time before answering. "I don't know. I'd like to say I would have spoken earlier, that I would have been more insistent, that I would have forced the adults to listen to me from the very first day. But I was a child, a terrified child. And I think I did my best with what I had. No, if I could change something, it wouldn't be me. It would be us, society, the way we look at lonely people, the invisible, the homeless, the marginalized, because those were the ones Marcel Fournier targeted. Those were the ones nobody was looking for. And as long as we continue to ignore these people, as long as we continue to treat them as if they didn't matter, there will be other Marcel Fourniers." He looked directly at the camera. "Do you want to honor the victims? Then look around you. Really, look at that lonely person in the street. That neighbor we never see, that quiet employee who talks to no one. Do you see them? Acknowledge their humanity. Because when we stop seeing people as people, when we treat them like ghosts, we open the door to monsters." The documentary had a profound impact. Associations were created to help isolated people. Social monitoring programs were put in place. Training programs to learn to recognize signs of danger. It was a small step, a very small step, but it was something. In 2022, 50 years after the crimes, Lyon organized a commemorative ceremony. A plaque was installed at the site of the former modern butcher shop in memory of Sophie Marchand, Elaine Roussel, Eric Fontaine, and all the known and unknown victims of Marcel Fournier. May we never forget. May we always see. Thomas Beaumont, now age 59, gave a speech. His voice trembled slightly. 50 years ago, I was a child who loved playing detective. I searched for mysteries everywhere, and then I found one, a terrible one. And this mystery changed my life forever. But it is not of me that we must remember today. It is them, he pointed to the plaque, the 15 people whose names are engraved here. People who just wanted to live their lives, who had dreams, hopes, plans. He looked at the audience. Hundreds of people had come, young people who were not even born then, curious tourists, neighborhood residents, criminology students. All came to remember. Sophie Marchin wanted to open a sewing shop. She saved every penny. She had already chosen the name. La Petite Aiguille, she will never open it. Alain Roussel was divorced and alcoholic, yes, but he had a daughter of 8 years whom he saw every other weekend. That daughter is now 58 years old. She barely remembers her father's face. Éric Fontaine sold newspapers, but he also wrote poems, short stories. He dreamed of being published one day. These manuscripts were found in his attic after his disappearance. They were never published. His voice broke. They were people, real people with real lives. And they were stolen from us, not by fate, not by destiny, but by a man. A man who chose to see them as objects, as resources, as meat. Let us never make that mistake again. Let us never allow anyone to become invisible in our eyes. Because it is there in that invisibility that monsters hunt. The audience applauded. Some cried, others nodded gravely. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed that maybe something good could come from all this horror, that maybe the victims had not died in vain, that their memory could help protect other lives. But Thomas knew better than that. He knew that in another city, in another neighborhood, there was probably another Marcel Fournier. Perhaps not a butcher, perhaps not an anthropophage, but a predator nonetheless. Someone who saw people as objects, who smiled while planning, who waited for his moment because monsters exist. They have always existed, they will always exist. We cannot eliminate them completely, but we can learn to recognize them, to stop them, to protect those they target. And that is all we can really do. Stay vigilant, stay human, never stop seeing. That night, Thomas returned to the site of the modern butcher shop alone. It was cold. The wind blew between the buildings as it had 50 years before. He stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the commemorative plaque shine under the streetlights. And he thought of that 9-year-old boy who had had the courage to speak, who had faced his fear, who had done what was necessary, even when it was terrifying. That boy was still there somewhere inside him, always vigilant, always watching, always remembering. He raised his eyes to the windows of the surrounding buildings. Lives unfolded behind those windows. Families having dinner, children doing homework, lonely people watching television, normal lives, mundane lives, precious lives. And Thomas Beaumont made a silent vow. The same one he had made 50 years before in that dusty police station. The same one he renewed every day since. He would continue to watch, to see, to protect because someone had to. Because the victims deserved to be honored not with plaques and speeches, but through actions, vigilance, humanity. The wind blew harder. Thomas shivered, turned, began to walk. But before leaving the street, he looked back one last time. He looked at the place where the modern butcher shop had stood, the place where so much horror had occurred. And he whispered into the wind, I will never forget. None of us will ever forget. Then he returned home, to his life, to his wife, to his children, to the normality he had fought so hard to reclaim. But that night, like every night for 50 years, Thomas Beaumont had the same nightmare. He was 9 years old. He was looking through a window, a van arriving in the night. A man got out, a man who always smiled. And Thomas woke in a sweat, heart racing, remembering that monsters are real, that they smile, that they sell meat, that they live among us, and that we must never ever stop watching. The end. Lyon 1972-2022. 15 victims, 15 lives, 15 reasons never to forget. This story is true. Monsters exist. Stay vigilant.